Welcome to Ideas Through Time, where we explore the thoughts of history's greatest Western philosophers. I'm Zach Agoff, your host, here to make the transformative power of philosophy accessible to everyone. Let's kick off this episode with a quick thought experiment, one that most of us have probably considered at some point in our lives. Picture this. You've shipwrecked on a desert island with 20 complete strangers. Think Survivor, the reality TV show here, except maybe without the $1 million prize. What do you think would happen socially in this scenario? Would chaos erupt as everyone scrambles for power and resources? Or maybe would harmony prevail with everyone singing kumbaya around the campfire on their new private island? What factors would actually tip the balance between these two outcomes? What would influence the reality of these two possibilities? If these are interesting questions to you, I suggest that you stick around for this mini series as we are going to explore how political philosophers across history actually tackle these questions as they pertain to political organizations. Now, if resources were limited on this private island, it's pretty easy to imagine disputes erupting. Fights could break out, power struggles could arise, chaos could possibly ensue. So, to prevent this, the group might actually establish an organizational structure to manage conflicts and to enforce rules and perhaps even ensure everyone's survival. This structure could handle disputes, it could punish wrongdoers, and it could assign functional roles to different people. One person could be assigned to stoking the fire, another person could be out catching fish, etc. The important part here, though, is that the group might opt to form a binding agreement or a contract with each other to avoid falling into all out war with one another. And this would help them avoid the perpetuation of harmful behavior. And it could even possibly help them organize the group in a way that allows them to thrive under these circumstances. You know, depending on how we think about this thought experiment, we might have different opinions on what conditions might actually lead to this 20-person group of castaways organizing themselves in such a way. But it is exactly those kinds of questions that occupy the minds of many political philosophers. And it's these very themes that we will turn to in this mini series on social contract theory and the history of political philosophy. Welcome then to Ideas Through Time. If it's your first time here, do feel free to check out our previous episodes to get a broader sense of what kind of content you can expect from this podcast. But generally, this podcast consists of two kinds of series. The main Ideas Through Time series, which tracks the chronological development of philosophy over time in the West. And you can kind of consider this as the backbone of the podcast. And then there's the second side series, which is called Across Time, which deals with a particular concept or theme and how that particular concept was treated by different philosophers across the history of Western philosophy. Today's episode actually marks a rather momentous moment. It marks the first of our first ever Across Time series, which I'm super excited about. The series will deal with something called the social contract theory, a very general view in political philosophy that maintains that political organizations are legitimate and just in virtue of a kind of agreement or contract that's made between the citizens and the residing political organization. If that contract is coerced, just a fancy word for forced or kind of forced onto the constituents, or the terms of that contract are sufficiently broken, then the political organization would no longer be legitimate or just. In spirit of the fact that we in the US have an important election coming up and politics is likely on the top of many of our minds, certainly more than usual, probably, I thought it would be a good opportunity to introduce you all to the wonderful world of the history of political philosophy. In this episode, we'll consider some of the central questions of political philosophy, in particular, how political philosophy attempts to answer questions about what actually gives a political authority authority and what kinds of political organizations and bodies are just. One common way to answer these questions is to argue that there is some kind of explicit or maybe even implicit agreement between the public or the constituents and the political authority. However, this general view takes many, many different forms, many different shapes throughout history, from the authoritarianism that we find in Thomas Hobbes to the more explicit liberalism of John Locke, Jean Jacques Rousseau, and um, John Rawls. Often the differences in the kind of contract that is formed depend on the initial conditions within which the agreement is made. To get at those initial conditions, social contract theorists tend to posit hypothetical historical situations where no contract had yet been formed. We might think that, for instance, in nature, there are no political organizations per se. Political organizations would then be a kind of artifice or a construct that humans form in order to serve various functions that meet the needs of the public or not. So, different social contract theorists consider what a state of nature would look like for human beings, where there is a group of humans who have not yet formed an intentional, structured political organization. Depending on what we think that original state looks like, each theorist comes to different conclusions on what the role of the government body is and what it is protecting us from. Hobbes, for instance, as we'll see in later episodes, thinks that the state of nature is really just nothing more than a state of war. People will take advantage of one another and defend their self interest at the detriment of others. This leads him to argue, through many other steps in his argument, that only an absolute sovereign with absolute power could deter social groups from devolving back into a state of nature. But not all philosophers agree that the state of nature is so violent and self interested. And given these differences, other philosophers conclude that different forms of government are more beneficial than the kind that Hobbes defends. Here's how the episode is going to look today. First, we're going to look at some of the central terms that are important for political philosophy, like political philosophy, liberalism, and justice. Then, we're going to hone in more specifically on the social contract theory and some of the themes that persist through the many different versions of it. Now, given that the social contract has been discussed since ancient Greek philosophy, we'll consider one of those examples, one of those ancient examples in this episode specifically. Specifically, we'll look at Plato's Credo. This will be a nice warm up for our much more in depth discussions in future episodes when we turn to more modern philosophers who leverage and even systematize the social contract in ways that the Greeks simply did not. We'll then close out the episode with a brief overview of what to expect in the episodes to come, and I'll offer some discussion questions that you can use, hopefully, to chat with your friends or your family about these very topics. So let's go ahead and jump on in. Now, I always like to start with, you know, defining terms for everybody as best I can, at least. But still, it is helpful to get some basic terms onto the table for all of you. So let's just start with the most fundamental term here, political philosophy. There are 3 or 4 primary branches or disciplines in philosophy: metaphysics, which studies reality, the nature of reality; epistemology, which studies the theories, theorizes about knowledge; value theory; and then logic. Some people include logic, some people don't. That's why it's 3 or 4. But I'll include it in the list here. Now, value theory, the third branch, has at least 2 subdisciplines: ethics and political philosophy. Ethics tends to deal with the moral weight and normativity of individual actions, whereas political philosophy deals more squarely with themes like justice and authority and things of the like. Political philosophy then really often has to do with a larger scale than ethics. Ethics is more about the individual, while political philosophy is about the broader social community. But political philosophy isn't just about community ethics. Political philosophy is actually more narrow than this. After all, political bodies are pretty unique among corporate or communal bodies, that is, just groups of individuals. After all, private corporations like businesses or schools are corporate bodies, but they don't share in the ability to like dole out punishment, placing people in prison or declaring war on other nations or demanding taxes or anything like that. Political organizations then have a kind of unique power that they can exert over their constituents, unlike private corporations or other sorts of communities. Political philosophy then is specifically about the legitimacy and the justice of these both theoretical and real political constitutions. Now, social contract theory tends to correspond to the development of another thing called liberalism. By this, I don't mean that social contract theorists are liberal in the popular sense of the term nowadays. I doubt John Locke would be voting for many of the Democrats of today's political landscape, though he is a classic liberal in political philosophy. That said, liberalism in political philosophy tends to refer to views that defend the reality of individual rights, the possession of private property, the use of market economies, a separation of religious organizations from political power, and a variety of freedoms, like the freedom of expression or the freedom of the press and more. Liberals tend also to care about the consent of the constituents to their ruling body. That is, they are against being coerced or forced into the acceptance of a given political authority. Now, political philosophers are also notoriously interested in the definition of justice and finding the right kind of system to guarantee a just society or social arrangement. But admittedly, it's a bit hard to define justice abstractly here, given that justice is just defined so differently by different philosophers. For instance, Plato's conception of justice that he develops in Republic is completely different than John Locke's. But as we'll see in liberalism, again, very generally conceived, a given political constitution or organization can be deemed just when an individual would rationally opt in to that society. That is, one could rationally opt into being governed by that particular political organization. What makes it rational to opt into a given society? Well, it's in our interest to opt in. If a person can't rationally do this, then that society isn't just. As we've already touched on a bit, social contract theorists generally hold that legitimacy and justice of a given political constitution depends on the citizens of that constitution willingly consenting to living under that constitution. But this view, as mentioned earlier, is systematized only in later medieval and primarily early modern philosophers, and especially in figures that secularize the social contract, as in figures like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau in the 17th and 18th centuries. That is the 16 and 1700s. But it actually dates much further back than that. Indeed, even Plato, one of the first great Greek philosophers, fiddles around with this idea of a social contract, though it's found in other ancient figures like Epicurus. Our next episode will deal mostly with these more modern philosophical characters. So let's use an ancient philosopher today to just get a sense of how social contract logic works. Let's look at Plato's work, Crito, more specifically. For those who don't know much about Plato, he was one of the first Greek philosophers to truly approach philosophy systematically. That is, there are surviving texts of his where he grapples with each of the different philosophical disciplines or domains like metaphysics, epistemology, value theory, etc. And indeed, Plato is concerned with the intersection of each of these disciplines. For instance, his value theory, as you see in Republic, for instance, interacts in very important ways with his metaphysical views or views about the nature of reality. Now, we haven't actually gotten to Plato in our main Ideas Through Time series yet, so I can't direct you to some video to get you caught up on Plato's philosophy. But do look for that episode in the coming months once we make it through the pre Socratic philosophers. Nonetheless, it will be helpful for you to know some things about Plato for the purposes of this episode. First, Plato was famously a pupil or student of Socrates, and he went on to be the mentor or teacher of Aristotle. So these three figures, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, are typically considered the Socratic philosophers of ancient Greece. Second, there are over 30 surviving works by Plato, some more well known than others, for sure. Also, some of them are more certainly written by Plato, and others are it's questionable whether he actually wrote them. But generally, his works are written in dialogue form, featuring a few different people discussing some philosophical topic. And most often, these dialogues feature his mentor, Socrates. Now, most of what we know about Socrates actually comes from Plato's work, but at different points in Plato's work, Socrates plays a different literary role, per se, and philosophical role. Earlier dialogues are generally thought to be more accurate representations of Socrates' thought, while later dialogues are generally, again, thought to represent more and more of Plato's own philosophical thoughts and opinions. That is, Socrates more and more becomes the mouthpiece of Plato's own philosophical views. Now, the theme of the social contract crops up at least twice in Plato's work. The first one is in one of Plato's early dialogues, Crito, where Socrates defends some form of the social contract. And then the second point at which it pops up is in a work that's probably the most famous of Plato's. It comes from his middle period and it's called Republic. In this work, Plato, through the voice of Socrates, argues against the social contract theory, though it is proposed by one of his primary interlocutors, Glaucon. Now, in this episode, we're only going to be looking at Crito. While the treatment of the social contract is super interesting in the Republic, it requires a lot of background on Plato's thought to actually make sense of his critique. So we'll get to that stuff at some later point in later episodes of this podcast. Now, the context within which Plato's Crito takes place is actually pretty dramatic. The dialogue occurs while Socrates is actually in prison awaiting his execution. Crito, his interlocutor, is urging Socrates to escape prison and settle somewhere outside of Athens, getting away from people that vehemently disagree with him. But Socrates actually defends his decision to opt for death rather than exile. So this is a pretty big deal. Socrates literally could have escaped death and moved to another city, but he opted not to. And he offers a rational philosophical argument to defend that decision that relies specifically on the social contract. Now, in our previous episode, we talked for a while about philosophical arguments. If you missed that episode, you can get more details there. It's just the previous episode to this one, episode 005. But in short, a philosophical argument consists of a series of statements or sentences that are either true or false that support a conclusion, which is just another statement or sentence that is either true or false. Presumably, if a person is defending an argument, they will be aiming to demonstrate first that all of their supporting claims or statements or premises are true, and secondly, that these statements imply the truth of their conclusion. Now, a big part of the history of philosophy is actually to dig into texts and reconstruct philosophical arguments from different philosophical texts. Often these historical philosophers don't just give us their distilled argument. It is the job of the historian to do this, which requires grappling with passages and doing a lot of interpretive work. This is a big part of the job of a historian of philosophy. If you are interested in doing this, I highly encourage you to go pick up a copy of Crito and give it a shot after listening to this episode. In fact, in future episodes, if you're interested in working on reconstruction and digging into these figures more, I encourage you to go pick up copies of the texts that we're talking about and practicing this discipline yourself. It's a very valuable thing to learn how to do. But whenever a person wants to reconstruct a philosophical argument, I always first suggest that they identify the conclusion of the argument first. That is, we should identify the true or false claim that the argument is supporting or arguing is actually true. What exactly is the argument trying to establish, or what is it trying to defend? The conclusion in this case, in Credo, is that Socrates, the conclusion is that Socrates should not escape prison and should not go into exile outside of Athens. Notice that this claim is either true or false. It is either the case that Socrates should or he should not escape prison and go into exile. So, given this conclusion, how does Socrates actually defend it? Some context will help us here. Crito is a wealthy friend of Socrates who comes to implore him to escape the prison that he's currently in and seek exile. He's under the impression that the ruling against Socrates was an unjust political maneuver. That is, perhaps the sentence should have been lighter, or even the fact that he was tried at all was unjust from the start. Either way, it's supposed that the verdict of Socrates' trial was unjust or wrong. He shouldn't have been sentenced to death. Now, Socrates ultimately argues that since he grew up in Athens and enjoyed the benefits of being within the Athenian society and having participated in the local political and social culture, he had implicitly consented to the laws of the land. He could have, for instance, moved somewhere else or moved to overthrow the government or some other relevant action, but he didn't. He opted to stay in Athens, enjoy life there, commit himself to life as a philosopher in Athens, and thus consent to living under the laws. The laws permitted him to be sentenced to death, and so he is obligated, for fear of breaking his implicit contract, to go along with the political body's decision to sentence him to death. Now, why is Socrates even being sentenced to death? I realize I didn't explain this. The ruling political authority thought that Socrates was corrupting the youth with his philosophy, and that was the reason why he was being sentenced to death. So, just to give you a little more background. Now, we might say that Socrates is arguing that an injustice cannot correct what appears to be another injustice, when that injustice is perpetuated by a system that one has consented to live under. The thrust of the argument then is basically this: if you don't like the system, you should move. If you don't move, be content with the consequences of your decision. Something along those lines. Socrates was not forced to stay in Athens. He was not coerced. He could have left, and he didn't. And this places him in a kind of implicit contract that subjects him to the laws of the place he is willingly living. So maybe we can make this argument a bit more formal. What I mean by this is we can distill the argument into premises or supporting statements and then leading to a conclusion. So the first premise here would be we should never commit injustice or do something wrong. The second premise is that if Socrates escapes, then he is committing a kind of injustice or doing something wrong. And therefore, Socrates should not escape and seek exile. Now, the argument is valid. That is, the conclusion follows logically from the premises or the supporting statements, so long as those statements are true. And this means that if we're to evaluate or critique the argument, we have to actually critique the truth of the premises. If even one premise is false, then the argument fails. That is, the conclusion isn't established by the argument as true. Of course, the conclusion could still be true, supported by some other argument, but the argument that is given doesn't support or demonstrate its truth. Premise one states that we should never commit injustice or do something wrong. While we obviously all fail at this, I think many of us will maintain that it is nonetheless true. Committing injustices is wrong, and so we shouldn't do it. We may disagree about what constitutes a particular injustice, but that doesn't matter for the general claim to actually be true. For any action that we consider unjust, and we may disagree on what actions actually qualify as just or unjust, we ought not do that unjust action. Of course, some of you may disagree with this. Fine, that's totally cool. Let me know, though, why this premise is false in the comments of this episode. I would be curious to hear your argument for why that first premise is false. Otherwise, that leaves us with just the second premise, which says that if Socrates escapes, then he is committing an injustice. This premise is defended with Socrates' conception of the social contract, mediated, of course, by Plato, who's actually the author of this work. The premise is true only if Socrates is bound to Athenian law by an implicit contract he made by willingly enjoying the goods of Athenian life and not moving away to another city at some earlier point. Now, I think this is actually where things get philosophically interesting. If this is the case, then Socrates had to have the ability to move away from Athens. And this could have been the case. Um, I genuinely actually don't know how flexible ancient Greeks were geographically. It didn't really come up in my research for this episode. But presumably, if we were to generalize the argument and take it as our own, take it as true for ourselves as well, giving us the capacity to insert our own name into the argument instead of Socrates's, then presumably we would have had to have the capacity to leave our own country. If we don't, then we are not implicitly agreeing to the law of the land. We are simply stuck there. And if we are not implicitly consenting to the law of the land, then the social contract is not what gives legitimacy to the political authority. You see the problem here? It is basically that the premise relies on the claim that we could live somewhere else, but don't opt to. And this implicitly commits us to be subject to the local political authority. But if we literally don't possess the capacity to move somewhere else, are we really consenting to the laws? I want to encourage you all actually to think this through quite a bit more on your own time. Is Socrates right about the social contract? Do we actually have an implicit agreement with our political authorities which binds us to their political decisions in some way, even when it is at our own disadvantage? Think about it, talk about it with your friends. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Now, there is so much to go, so much more that happens in Plato's Credo, so much more to go over with respect to this text, which we probably will at some later point when we actually turn to Plato specifically. And so I'm really just giving you a bird's eye view of the work, just to give you a sense of the flavor of social contract arguments. We're going to go on to see much more intricate arguments in later figures that I mentioned earlier in this episode, like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, etc. So as we move forward in the next episodes, we'll be looking at the social contract applied on a more systematic level. Um, like I said, we'll turn first to Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher from the 17th century. And though Hobbes is probably going to appear a little bit crazy to all of you, his work is considered by many to be one of the greatest historical works in political philosophy that's written in the English language. So he's a big deal. His views are a little out there, perhaps, but it'll be interesting for all of you to hear about, I'm sure. Following Hobbes, we're going to turn to John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And then following these figures, we'll turn to critics of the social contract. I'm still deciding on exactly who we're going to talk about, but two of the people we probably will talk about are John Stuart Mill and Marx. In the final episodes of the series, we'll also turn to more contemporary figures that have reinvigorated the social contract theory in more recent times. For instance, John Rawls. Rawls opened up many avenues for debate in contemporary political philosophy. So perhaps in the future, we can actually look at some of the central criticisms of his political philosophy from other contemporary philosophers, but that'll be for some later time. As we prepare for our next episodes, then, I have some homework for you. This is important for you to do if you want to really grapple with the topics that we're covering in this podcast. So try to find a friend or a family member and describe the idea of the social contract to them to the best of your ability, just to get them on the table with what the concept even is. Try to figure out whether they agree that we are subject to the laws of government in virtue of an implicit contract or agreement that we've formed by opting to not move away to a different land, as Socrates argues in Crito. Now, here's the important part. If they agree with that view, I want you to try to take on the opposite view. Offer some critiques of this understanding of the legitimacy of laws. If they disagree with that view, try to take on the opposite view of them as well. Offer some defenses of the social contract. Do this all in a friendly, collaborative way. Philosophy should be a collaborative pursuit through argumentation, but a collaborative argumentation. There's no need for hostility. So examine the reasons that people give for or against the social contract and evaluate whether they're good reasons or bad reasons. And be sure to really grapple with why. Why do you think that they're good or bad reasons? Okay, so that's the homework. Shouldn't be too hard, I hope. Um, I guess, asking for civil conversations about politics might be a bit of a stretch, but what could go wrong? Anyhow, I've kept you all for too long. Have a wonderful weekend or week, and I look forward to seeing all of you next week for another episode of Ideas Through Time. Bye for now.